Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the closing conversation of the Ashoka Changemaker Summit called Climate Narratives of Possibility. Now, why do we dedicate such a precious time, the final session of an event like this one, talking about stories or about narratives of the environment? And you already know this, but the truth is that we are living in an unprecedented historical moment. It is clear now that the time for incremental change is over. We need to reform our global economy. We need to cut by half our emissions in 2030, that's maybe 8 years from now. And we need to go towards net zero in 2050. This is by far the most ambitious and biggest challenge humanity has ever faced. And the next 8 years will determine the quality and quantity of human life in the centuries to come. And as Indy said, climate change is a symptom of how we deeply are in relationship not only with the planet, but also with ourselves and with others. However, even though it is crystal clear that we need to move into action, we are surrounded by a mainstream narrative of doom and gloom, of apocalypse, of too late, too little, too late. It almost feels like a narrative of extinction, and it actually is. We are on the highway to climate hell, where the opening words of Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, in the COP27 meeting in Egypt. And while we painfully acknowledge that apocalypse is now true for a lot of people in the world who are suffering the devastating effects of the climate crisis, we also realize that this apocalyptic narrative won't serve us well. As Rebecca Solnit puts it, climate despair is a luxury. Those facing floods, wildfires, and droughts cannot afford to lose hope, and neither should or could we. According to the largest survey of its kind by The Lancet, 45% of teens and young adults said that climate anxiety was affecting their daily lives and ability to function. And 56% said that they thought humanity is doomed. In other words, half of the world's young people don't think they have a future. And this is leading us to a very profound and I would say dangerous state of collective paralysis. There has been a shift in focus from climate denialism to climate fatalism. And it seems like we're stuck in a climate horror movie. And so we believe it's time to change the script of our lives and of this movie. We need to provide people with the hope and the inspiration to build a future which is exciting and meaningful and where everyone can contribute to make it an even better place. And this is where we come in, and this is why we're here today. Science now shows us two things. One, humans believe stories more than they believe facts. Personal experiences and anecdotes are much more trusted than facts and statistics. It's crazy, but it's true. And the second one, stories stick. They are remembered 22 times more than facts. Isn't that crazy? And until now, science, technology, and politics have led the way. Scientific reports have set the direction, but they are not enough to bring the level of motivation or stories we need. The 1.5-degree limit has fortunately established a planetary boundary, but it's failing to mobilize everyone to take action or feel hopeful. Now it's time for another player, culture. We need a culture of climate possibility, of hope, of excitement for what's to come. We need to turn facts into stories that mobilize, a new set of scripts for this movie. This is why I personally believe that the most extraordinary and fascinating revolutions in the coming years is going to be the environmental quest for agency. Hundreds, millions using their change-making power to rebalance our relationship with the planet. Not only by voting or by eating less meat, but also in the millions of decisions they take, in their parenting models, the schools they choose, the jobs they choose, or their own definition of success. And the great news is that narratives can and will take us there. They have the power to take us from incremental to exponential. They connect the individual with the system, and they shift mindsets and behavior, and have the power to influence decision-making at large. Dear audience, welcome to the fascinating era of climate narratives. My name is Alexandra Mitjans, and I currently lead Ashoka's work around planet and climate. And today I'm tremendously excited to be joined and hosting this panel with three people that I honestly admire. Saltmarshe sits at the intersection of culture, narrative, and systems change. She is the co-founder of the Long Time Project, which seeks to cultivate a culture of stewardship across society. And she's also the co-founder of the Reset Narratives community, a platform that brings together organizations working in narrative storytelling across the environment, economy, and social justice. You can come up. Thank you, Ella. Luis Alberto Camargo is an Ashoka Fellow and works to reconnect youth to nature and people to earth in order to build a more sustainable, regenerative future. He's the co-founder and director of OPEPA, a non-profit organization in Colombia, so he actually came in from Colombia, focusing on the advancements of nature-based regenerative education, heritage interpretation, and the practice of weaving. Thank you, Luis. And Solitaire Townsend. Solitaire is the co-founder of Futerra. She advises governments, charities, and brands on imagining a better future and making it happen. She is the chair of the UK Green Energy Scheme, a member of the United Nations Sustainable Lifestyles Task Force, and a London leader for sustainability. And she also has a master's degree, not only in sustainability, but also in Shakespeare, so it's a perfect combination. Thank you. So, the question that we want to see answered in the next 40 minutes or so is, what are the future narratives that will enable massive environmental agency? And how do we convert the anger, the frustration, and the despair into hope, into purpose, and into change-making? And so maybe let's start with a positive note, since this is also about building hope. We always say that in order to create the future, we first need to be able to imagine it. And so my first question for the three of you is, what future or futures do you imagine? And if you were to design the cover page of Time magazine in 2050, what cover do you imagine?
I'll take that first, and it's wonderful to be here with Ashoka and with all of you, and by the end of this session, you are going to be shit-hot storytellers, able to influence the world and change the direction that we're going in. There we go. Woo, hell yeah. So, I'm also now silent. I'm very, very dyslexic. And what that meant was that when I was 11 years old, I still couldn't read. I wasn't able to read. I then had a really bad accident and went into hospital. Don't worry, this isn't a tragic story. And this was hospital in the 1980s. There was no television, there were no Game Boys, there was no mobile phones. I was out of my fucking mind with boredom. And so I taught myself to read out of boredom. And because I didn't know any better, I started to read adult books. I started to read things like Lord of the Rings and Ursula Le Guin and Jemima Butler and Asimov. And I read a lot of science fiction. Now, I don't know what that does to a person, the first books they ever read being a whole series of adult science fiction. But what it meant was that as a teenage girl, I was immersed in the future, in these many, multiple, brilliant stories of the future, from Star Trek to, we now have Afrofuturism, Wakanda now. I think we have millions, hundreds of millions of stories of a better future. It's called science fiction. And I think that that is what increasingly people are beginning to hang on to and hold on to in this moment. And it's one of the reasons why I think it was Jemima Butler who said that the current paradigm are afraid of the storytellers because the storytellers show that another world is possible. So for a start, we won't have front covers of Time magazine in 2050 because print media won't exist anymore. But what we will have in 2050 is hundreds of thousands of positive visions of the future, just like we have today.
Please.
Well, in my case, with this question, I try to close my eyes and see the cover, and I agree. I think it's going to be a time where covers will not be static, first of all. So it's going to be a dynamic process of interactions. But I was seeing the stories of emerging, thriving, rewilded cities. Cities that blended into nature and nature blended into cities, and where humans were able to start picking up the capacity to live with nature as if they were nature.
Beautiful.
Firstly, thank you for having me here. And I'm so aware that all of you are storytellers. And over the last few days, I've heard so much incredible insight around narrative from people in this room. So part of me just wants to give you the mic and stop talking. But 2050. So when you first posed the question, Alex, the first thing that came to mind was Greta and Vanessa Nakate around their 50th birthdays, surrounded by young children, and the kind of feeling being, we did it. We did it. And they have helped us build the regenerative societies that we need. So that was the vision. But I guess it's worth taking a step back and looking at what we're all doing here, which is not traditionally what the environment movement has done. So we've spent an awful lot of our comms time looking at the cracks in the existing system, highlighting what's wrong, highlighting what's not working. And that is so important systemically. We have to do that work. But we can't only do that work. Because if we only do that work, where do we leave people? We just leave people deeply aware of what isn't working with no pathways to change. And so I think as a movement over the last few years, there's been this understanding that we have to start building these futures for people. We have to put flesh on the emerging futures that we are trying to make happen. And that when we do that, we would do well to be quite aware of how we're doing that. So this whole world of futures is often quite a colonial world. So when we look at scenario planning and a lot of the tools that are used for futuring, it's no coincidence perhaps that they were developed in fossil fuel companies. They are very extractive ways of engaging with the future. So they are ways of evoking with the future to exploit it, to plan, to prepare, to exploit it. And one of the things that I've learned over the last few years is all these other ways of engaging with the future, of indigenous futurism, queer futurism, Afrofuturism, and that yes, we need this work to happen at scale, this work of collective imagination, of building the imagination infrastructure, and we need to do that not with a colonial mindset of exploiting the future.
And so, thank you. It actually works. I feel, can you hear me? I feel a bit more hopeful now. we're going to dig deeper on those emerging futures, but what's stopping us? So going back to this last comment, what's getting on the way of us getting to these emerging futures? From a narrative perspective, obviously.
I think there's two levels of answer to that. So there's one, what are the narratives that are getting in the way? And then what are the structures that are getting in the way? So from a narrative perspective, I think we're seeing a move from denialism to delayism. So incrementalism, 2050ism, delayism, really now being one of the big obstacles that we're facing. I know in the UK at the moment there is a narrative that is very pernicious, which is the let 1,000 flowers bloom narrative around energy. So this sense of we just have to do it all. We're running out of time, and yes, we need renewables, but we need to keep pioneering with fossil fuels, etc. And that is a very dangerous narrative, but it doesn't seem it. It seems a very benign narrative. So we've got these kind of delayism, incrementalism narratives. We have got these narratives that disempower people. So fatalism is an overwhelm, an apathy are some of the key problems that we're facing. And I think as campaigners, we have to be so careful with this balance between urgency and agency, and to be clear that the way we evoke urgency doesn't deny people agency. And I think that's something that we're still really battling with as a movement. And then beneath that, there is this question of the infrastructure behind the stories we tell. And I often look at what the other side is doing. The huge amount of resource that goes into telling stories that are incredibly damaging to the work that we do, whether that is via the advertising industry, the huge amount of work that goes into making us believe we're consumers, making us believe a certain version of the good life, through to work that goes in by vested interests, to huge culture campaigns. You know, the Daily Wire recently put $100 million into children's entertainment. So that's a right-wing news platform in the US. So that we are up against some quite mighty forces when it comes to the scale of cultural and narrative power.
I would totally build on that. And in fact, Ella mentioned the 2050s and thinking too far in the future. I see there's two big meta-narratives at the moment. One narrative is the Frankenstein story. The Frankenstein story is a morality story. Man makes monster, and then monster destroys man. It's a very old story. We've had it in society for a very long time, that morality tale. And that's the tale of climate change. And it's really narratively compelling. There's a sort of necessity, a narrative necessity for the fact that through our hubris, we created this monster, and now it's going to come back and get us. And as you said, the other side can play into that a lot. But there's another story, and it's a much more pernicious one, and it's one that probably you don't see, because you're not the target audience for it. And it's not the 2050s, it's the 1950s. So there is a very strong push to roll back to a petro-patriarchy of the 1950s. That's being explicitly driven out of the United States. But remember, the United States' biggest export is stories, Hollywood, etc. And it is a very compelling message of safety, of hierarchy, of clear roles, of people knowing their place. And of course, it's a story at which heterosexual, able-bodied white men are the top of. And so we're seeing an explicit, deliberate investment in that story through Hollywood, through children's program, and through elsewhere. And when you've got two stories, which is we're all going to fucking die versus we go back to the 1950s, it's not much of a choice for a lot of people. 1950s or death. To be honest, I'm not sure which way I'd choose on that. The 1950s were pretty shit. But what we don't have is a third story, that story of the way things could be. And that third story isn't actually science fiction. It's you. You are that story. Not what you're doing, not the specifics of how you're making change, but how fantastic your life is, how great you feel, how healthy you are, how motivated you are, what sense of purpose, what sense of joy, what connection, what belonging, all those things that human beings are desperate for, particularly belonging and connection, you have because you're change makers. And that's the story. It's not a picture on the front of Time. It's basically you telling people how great it is to be you. That's the story we have to tell.
And I would add that it's not only the story we tell, it's how we tell the stories. And I think what you were saying just now makes me really think at the way we're telling stories right now. And if you look at the environmental movement and activism throughout the last 30 years, it's been telling stories of resistance. So we're pushing walls, and most of our storytelling energy has been at pushing against something, pushing against petroleum, pushing against corporates, pushing against governments, pushing against anything, and believing that by pushing, we're validating our position. And I think actually the way we tell stories of pushing or resistance in our environmental ply is actually inhibiting our capacity to move forward. So I think the resistance needs to be changed, and needs to be changed towards the stories of flow, the stories of moving forward. How are we going to build future and emerging futures? So when we talk about emergency, we are at an emergency, but an emergency more than a situation of resistance and panic is a situation of opportunity and emergence. Emergence. So we really need to tap into the emergent capacity of opportunities, of shifting into those new stories that allow us to tell the story, as you said, of everything that has potential, of the synergies, of our capacity to put together our intelligence, our technology, and our love of life into a story of transformation that will allow us to move forward instead of push backwards.
100%. Could I just really strongly recommend a TED Talk by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who has a TED Talk all about how important it is to take joy in climate action, to not look so fucking miserable all the time, and to actually show that doing things that are better for the world are joyous, they're fun, they have personal benefits. And that word joy is a word that must become the most important word in what we do, because people want to buy joy, they want to join joy, they want to feel joy, whereas actually we look pretty miserable most of the time. That's not a movement people want to join. We need to become a movement of joy.
So in that joy and in that emergence, one of the things that the team have learned, thanks to you in the last months, is this idea that narratives is not really a destination, and that they're truly, truly plural. Now, my question is, what are those deep narrative journeys, and how do we incentivize them more in this vision of building an everyone a changemaker world?
I think it's a really important point that this work is not about coming up with a one singular perfect narrative and then somehow imposing that on a planetary level. One of the ways I like to think is about narrative principles. So what are some of the principles which will give birth to a multitude of different kinds of stories? And I guess at the heart of the principles that I find helpful are two things: love and power. So principles that help us generate love, help us feel the love for the people, the places, the things we care about in the world, and narratives that help us access our power. And so within that, there are kind of three categories. And I've taken this from the work of Alex Evans, who wrote a book called The Myth Gap that I keep finding very helpful over the years. And so the first category are narratives of a larger us, narratives that help us expand our empathy And so those can be narratives that help us expand our empathy to other species, to other cultures, to other times. So a larger us, a longer now. So narratives that help us expand our understanding of time. So that's the reason I've set up something called the Long Time Project. And one of the things that we found is that these narratives of stewardship are incredibly potent. So helping people think about what it means to be a good ancestor transcends political divides. So values of stewardship appeal to the left and the right. And for me, that's about, yes, thinking forward, but also thinking back into the deep, deep history of our planet. And I spend quite a lot of time in deep time. And I found this fact recently, which just blew my mind, in that there's a period in the history of the Earth, there's 1 billion years where nothing happened. It's called, the geologists call it the boring billion. Nothing happened for 1 billion years. And in this billion years, apparently, complex life kept trying and failing to establish. So we all had single-celled organisms, but complex life kept trying and failing for 1 billion years. And then something shifted, tectonic plates started to move a little bit, the climate changed slightly, and suddenly the conditions were ripe for complex life. And so we got lichens, we got T-Rexes, we got us. But if we look back at the history of the planet, there are so many points when life could not have happened, when it could have gone another way. And Brian Eno recently talked about how do we re-enchant people with the amazing improbability of life on Earth. Re-enchantment with this amazing improbability of life on Earth. So for me, in this space of, if we're thinking of a longer now, longer time frames, we're in that terrain. And then finally, it's about stories which have a different version of the good life. Consumerism and capitalism have sold us a certain version of what life should look like. And what we're hearing when we're talking about these other futures are not that. And so we need stories that have another version of the good life. And all of those stories, as I mentioned before, have to build our agency. You know, people, all of you are involved in incredible movements to help people access their agency. The work of people like John Alexandra, who's looking at how do we move from narratives of being consumers to seeing ourselves as citizens. All of that work has to underpin everything we do.
Bravo.
I'm definitely sold with the love. And I think part of the understanding of stories is living stories. So for me, in nature-based education, I've learned that the most important story that we can tell is the story that we learn to live. And that story needs to come back to the story of falling back in love with nature, falling back in love with our nature, and understanding what that means. So for me, there is this really urgent action we need to do, and is to allow ourselves to fall back in love. And falling back in love is recuperating that sense of interdependence, interconnections with all life around us that allows us to understand our relations to ourselves, to others, and to nature as part of a continuum. And the only way we can actually shift towards a healthy planet, a healthy society, is by synchronizing our capacity to relate to each other in a respectful manner that actually creates the conditions for life to thrive. And I think this is where I love your long time history, because I always think, who is the master storyteller in our existence? And it's the Earth. You know, we told the story of 4.6 billion years ago to 3.8, that boring billion. But then from 3.8 to now, it's 3.8 billion years of stories that have been told, have developed, and have created a magical planet. The magical planet we live on. So not only falling in love, it's also being able to find awe when we look outside. You know, our technology, our modern lifestyles have pushed us away of observing what we have around us. But if you just give yourself one moment, even within a city, to look at the magic of nature, you will be at awe. And this awe is the essence of the, let's say, the result of an incredible story, a story of collaboration, a story of working together in diversity to create opportunities, to evolve, to innovate, and to create magic in this deep collaboration. So I think, you know, falling back in love and allowing everyone in our world to tap into that essential energy of the life and the magic that's around us is going to be fundamental for anyone to be able to tell a story that is different to the predominant story of now, which is very separate from living systems.
So I agree with both of those so passionately. I want to tell a story about it. So about 11 years ago, I was invited to Brazil. So excited, never been to Brazil. Beautiful, beautiful country. And I was in Rio de Janeiro. And I was doing some work, and I was doing some speeches. And I got invited to go to the Amazon, something which I'd wanted to do since I learned the Amazon existed as a little girl. I got invited by an oil company to go to the Amazon. But it was a whole set of us, and it was an oil company with some partners, had sponsored this eco-center in the Amazon that you could go and visit to understand what was happening in the Amazon and Amazon reforestation. So of course I said yes, I'd love to go to, and we went up to Manaus, which is on the edge of the Amazon, and they put us in these yellow sort of jumpsuits because you really, really don't want to get lost in the Amazon. So we're in these yellow jumpsuits, and we got onto one of those helicopters, those huge ones which have got the two trolleys like almost like a military helicopter, and we flew out over the Amazon, and it was unbelievable. An hour and a half flight out over the Amazon, seeing all of these stories of it's like a sea of trees, it's like a carpet of trees. It was absolutely spectacular. And then I thought I saw something in the distance, and it was flickering. I wasn't entirely sure what it was. And as we got closer and closer, I realized it was a flaring pipe. Because actually, the eco-center in the Amazon that I was being taken to was an oil rig in the Amazon. So an oil rig with a flaring pipe and those huge, big, white, bulbous gas capturers. And like my heart sunk. I was like, and of course there's no way I can go. I'm on a fucking helicopter in the Amazon. And so we landed, and we realized that we were at an oil rig in the center of the Amazon. And we were taken off, and we were welcomed by the workers on the oil rig, who have this sort of little a tradition where they pour crude oil over your hands. Because it's so pure, the oil from the Amazon is such good quality oil, you can safely put it on your skin. So there I am, in the center of the Amazon, at almost 100% humidity, and I'm British, I can't function in 100% humidity, with the stink of crude oil on my hands, with these lovely people who wanted to tell me about how they were like using a bit of a corner of the oil rig to grow orchids. And it was unbelievable, with this flaring pipe that I could barely bring myself to look at, with like this flame at the top, almost representing everything that was wrong with the world. And I was there, and I was like, and I was with some friends, and we'd just had a very bad meal, and we were standing in the humidity, and there was sweat dripping off my hair, and I gave up. I gave up. I was like, what the fuck can I do? How can I save the world when basically I'm at an oil rig in the center of the Amazon where people think that's so okay, they poured oil on my hands. And it was one of the worst, absolute worst moments of my life. What I didn't know was it was about to get even worse, because then a screaming alarm went off. Like the loudest sound, I'd heard a screaming alarm in the middle of the Amazon, because it turned out there was a fire. And I'm not sure if you kind of can imagine that basically if you're on a fire on an oil rig, you're standing on a bomb. It was, everybody screamed, everybody ran. The thing was running. I was hot, I was tired, I was running, they were pulling me, I fell over. So it makes my voice shake because I was so scared. I fell over in the Amazon at an oil rig on a bomb. And I scrambled to get up, and there's these deep spaces you can go to protect yourself if the whole thing's going to blow up. Probably wouldn't have worked, but anyway. And there was these two guys, literally local people from that area of the Amazon, from the indigenous communities, who were standing, holding the door open for me. Just two workmen. Never met them, never spoke to them. As I pulled myself up and scrambled, with my heart in my chest on this bomb, to run towards the door. I managed to get in the door, we pulled it shut, and we ran downstairs. And whilst we were sitting there waiting to blow up, actually all my hope came back. Because those two blokes risked their life to hold the door open for some British chick they'd never met who was stupid enough to fall over during a fire on an oil rig in the Amazon. And that their humanity, their kindness, their desire to actually risk their own lives, and the fact they hadn't even thought about it, discussed it. Of course you hold the door open for the woman who would be left out there on her own. And that left me coming back from that oil rig going, it's just technology. Oil's just technology. The people who came up with it, who invented it, thought they were doing a good thing. Many of the people who still work on it still think they're doing a good thing. But at heart, human beings are amazing. We're wonderful. We are evil and we're altruistic. We're horrible and we're wonderful. We will be incredibly selfish and we will risk our lives for others. We basically just have to choose oil rig in the Amazon or holding the door open for somebody at the risk of your own life. And I tell that story because it's a true story and it still sits with me so strongly, and I see them holding the door open, and I see the flaring pipe, and those are the two choices we have. But I also tell a story because I want you to tell stories like that. The story of why you're doing this. Not the story of the science or the statistics or the poverty or the exclusion. The story of what is it about you? What did you experience or discover? Think about that today. What journey have you been on to decide that this is work worth doing? Because I promise you, the story of you and the story of why you do this is 1,000,000 times more compelling than any fact or stat you could ever tell anybody.
Thanks, Ollie. What an amazingly moving story. But also, I really wanted to pick up on one of the points you were saying, which is really important, which is about how we think about humans, the story we tell ourselves about what it means to be human. And there's a strong story that does the rounds in the environment movement that humans are the problem, that we are the problem, that the world would be much better off without us. And maybe that will happen, and if that happens, it will be good for the world. And in some ways, the concept of the Anthropocene plays into that, the Anthropocene. It's attributing this destruction of the earth to humans, as opposed to what's really causing the destruction of the earth, which is not something intrinsic to being human, it's a particular economic and political system. And so the more we conflate with what it means to be human, with what it means to be human under capitalism, the less we become able to move beyond those economic systems. And I think it's so important because it is such a deep narrative animating quite a lot of movements at the moment. And instead, when you start to look beyond capitalism, you start to see all over the world cultures of stewardship, cultures of custodianship, another narrative of what it means to be human, a custodial humanity. And those are the stories we need to be telling, because if we are trying to mobilize people on a planetary level in an unprecedented way, and at the same time we're saying you're intrinsically bad, as humans you are intrinsically destructive to the planet, like, it's just not going to work. And so I think it's so important that all of us are really clear with how we feel about what it means to be human.
And maybe there, Ella, because we were talking a lot about stories, but I have a bit of a geeky questions, and my friends back home would appreciate. What is the connection between systems change, mindset shift, paradigm shift, narratives, storytelling? How would you map that visually.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk in the last few days about paradigm shift, about deep code, and all of that work is nested in story and narrative. So the great Donella Meadows, who has contributed so much to the field of systems change, in her work about the leverage points to intervene in a system, notes that intervening at the level of the paradigm is the most powerful place you can intervene to shift systems. And when we're intervening to change paradigms, we are intervening to change narratives. So this work of narrative change, narratives, if you like, are the soil from which everything else grows. If you want a more mechanistic metaphor, they're like the operating system. So all of our technology, our politics, our economics come from story. And I think as movements, it's taken us a while to realize this. For a long time, there was this idea that you do the real work and then you tell some stories about it. And finally, we are starting to realize that, oh, story is the real work. It is a technology. It is the most ancient technology that we have. And so when we're working to shift systems, we need to become aware of the invisible narratives that are animating our lives. You know, story is to human like water is to fish. We are all swimming in a sea of narrative that we do not see. We are like marionettes to the invisible narratives in our lives. And so if we're wanting to shift systems, we need to start to be able to be aware of what those narratives are and how we reauthor them. And so when we look, there's an iceberg model of narrative change, which is a very kind of old model, but one of the nice things about it is it shows the different levels of narrative work. And so the kind of top of the iceberg are the stories, the messages, the voices. Below that sit mindsets, and below that sits values. And that's why so much of this work is really thinking about what are the values that we want to underpin the mindsets, the stories that will lead to the regenerative futures we really urgently need.
And what do you think, Luis? Because you are one of the 630 Ashoka Fellows working to rebalance the relationship between humans and planet. And we always say that Ashoka Fellows are not only field catalysts, but you also distribute changemaker power at a large scale. So how do you foster these deep environmental identities, no? Changemaker identities?
I think precisely it's activating the capacity to tell stories, not only by being able to imagine the story you want to see the world to become, because all change makers have a vision. They want to see changes. They want to see a new way of being in the world, and that's what they're working for. But a way of telling the story is actually acting the story. So we need to act the stories we want to tell. And I think Joanna Macy's work is very complementary to Donella Meadows' work in the sense that it brings us to the idea of active hope. So how do we build active hope? And active hope being not the idea of hope, I wish we could, but the idea of active hope. I am building what I want. So I'm writing the story of the world I want to generate, I want to become. And I think this is one of the key aspects in change making we sometimes forget, is we really want to empower, and we need to work with everybody next to us to tap deeply into their selves, into their love, like we mentioned before, and from there to start writing a story of the world that makes sense, that is thriving, that is beautiful. Because that story, and I've worked with thousands of people, and every time I ask, what does wellness mean to you? What does, being really, truly happy means to you? If you go beyond the common story that everybody's gonna answer quickly, and you go underneath, the story is gonna be a common, universal story. And it's the story of life. It's a story of companionship. It's the story of kinship. It's the story of feeling you're in a paradise. And paradise being surrounded by living forms that are ultimately in care of you and you're in care of them. So I think the story of care, the story of love, ultimately becomes that key, let's say, cornerstone story that we can tap in. And it might sound a little romantic, I think sometimes, but only when people actually dig deep within themselves, they realize that's the essential story of humanity. So as Elle was saying, humanity is not intrinsically good or bad, but it's intrinsically nature. So intrinsically being nature is being in culture of care, in culture of sustaining life. And this is what mothers do, this is what the earth does. So I think it's tapping into that and really being able to bring out that potential and the synergies within all the people that are around us to create and embody and write that story today and not wait for that story to come or emerge, but we have to write it today, and this is the urgent action.
And Soli, how do we do that? Yeah, bravo. What are those cultural tipping points to promote this active hope that Luis is talking about?
Absolutely. So I think of story in society, and particularly in the parts of society that have the biggest footprint right now, because we have got to make very swift change as well as making some longer term change. So you have these deep tidal movements around who we are, our sense of place in the world, and those deep stories that are so intrinsic we don't even see them. And then you have some shorter stories which are about the system we want to live in, etc. And then you've got the little tiny tippy waves at the top. And sometimes in our movement we forget the little tippy waves. We want to only focus on the deep narrative change, that deep cultural change. But often it's changing those little small waves at the top that matter, and that changing those small stories. And so one of the stories which we've got to start getting right to bring about culture change is the benefit story. So the benefit story is to show all those people, many of whom are fundamentally different to us, have a different set of values and a different approach to the world, is to show them how much better their life, not all of our lives, or people in vulnerable and most affected regions, but how much better their life would be by taking action on this. How much better quality of sleep they would get, how much more safe they would feel, how much more connected to their kids and society they would be, how much thinner they would be by eating less meat, how better a sex life they would have, how much more attractive they would be. The things which a bunch of animals, a bunch of grey apes, which is all we are, care about. Those values such as belonging, self-efficacy, connection, spirituality, but also those things that we value, such as looking good in front of others, safety, security, acquisition, those selfish values. We have to show how taking action on sustainability, how actually doing something yourself in your life, however you choose to do it, comes with more benefits than what you're currently getting. That's becoming an easier and easier story to sell, as basically people get less healthy, more afraid, and less connected, which is what they're currently being sold by advertising. Basically, they've been sold a crock of shit. And so we actually have got a much better product to sell. And I'm deliberately using language like product and sell, because that's what we're up against for the next 8 years. We have a much better product to sell, because living a sustainable lifestyle, taking action, speaking up, being more engaged in your community has real tangible benefits for the individual. And the best way to tell that story is, again, to show and tell how you are experiencing those benefits. To show and tell how you are happier, healthier, have better sleep, have a better sex life because of the action that you're taking on sustainability. Because remember, we are the story. I do work with Netflix, with Disney. I'm working with people about these big meta stories. Most people don't get to do that. You get to tell your story. And that is the most powerful thing that you can do. But remember, if nobody would want to be you, then you're never going to convince them. You've got to show them how wonderful it is being a change maker. And then it becomes a much, much, much easier story to tell.
Wonderful. Thank you, Soli, Luis, Ella. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. When Dr. Martin Luther King inspired a nation and the world, he didn't do that with a nightmare, he did it with a dream. And this is why this conversation is so important. The climate story needs to be decoupled from the apocalyptic story. And this is why the climate crisis is a crisis of imagination, it's a crisis of communication. And this is why we need to be having these conversations. If we're not able to imagine the future, how are we meant to build it, right? We will be sitting in the coffee area, so feel free to join us for questions and feedback and ideas. This is a working team, so we're happy to continue working with all of you. Thank you.